Leon Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed, Chapter 8, Foreign Policy and the Army. Number 1. From World Revolution to Status Quo. Foreign policy is everywhere and always a continuation of domestic policy, for it is conducted by the same ruling class and pursues the same historic goals. The degeneration of the governing stratum in the Soviet Union could not but be accomplished by a corresponding change of aims and methods in Soviet diplomacy. The theory of socialism in one country, first announced in the autumn of 1924, already signalized an effort to liberate Soviet foreign policy from the program of international revolution. The bureaucracy, however, had no intention to liquidate therewith its connection with the Communist International. That would have converted the latter into a world oppositional organization, with resulting unfavorable consequences in the correlation of forces within the Soviet Union. On the contrary, the less the policy of the Kremlin preserved of its former internationalism, the more firmly the ruling clique clutched in its hands the rudder of the Communist International. Under the old name, it was now to serve new ends. For the new ends, however, new people were needed. Beginning with the autumn of 1923, the history of the Communist International is a history of the complete renovation of its Moscow staff and the staffs of all the national sections, by way of a series of palace revolutions, purgations from above, expulsions, etc. At the present time, the Communist International is a completely submissive apparatus in the service of Soviet foreign policy, ready at any time for any zigzag whatever. The bureaucracy has not only broken with the past, but has deprived itself of the ability to understand the most present lessons of that past. The chief of these lessons was that the Soviet power could not have held out for 12 months without the direct help of the international, and especially the European, proletariat, and without a revolutionary movement of the colonial peoples. The only reason the Austro-German military powers did not carry their attack upon Soviet Russia through to the end was that they felt behind their back the hot breath of the revolution. In some 3/4 of a year, insurrections in Germany and Austro-Hungary put an end to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. The revolt of the French sailors in the Black Sea in April 1919 compelled the government of the Third Republic to renounce its military operations in the Soviet South. The British government, in September 1919, withdrew its expeditionary forces from the Soviet North under direct pressure from its own workers. After the retreat of the Red Army from the vicinity of Warsaw in 1920, only a powerful wave of revolutionary protests prevented the Entente from coming to the aid of Poland and crushing the Soviets. The hands of Lord Curzon, when he delivered his threatening ultimatum to Moscow in 1923, were bound at the decisive moment by the resistance of the British workers' organizations. These clear episodes are not peculiar. They depict the whole character of the first and most difficult period of Soviet existence. Although the revolution triumphed nowhere outside the limits of Russia, the hopes of its triumph were far from being fruitless. During those years, the Soviet government concluded a series of treaties with bourgeois governments. The Brest-Litovsk Peace in 1918, a treaty with Estonia in 1920, the Riga Peace with Poland in October 1920, the Treaty of Rapallo with Germany in April 1922, and other less important diplomatic agreements. It could never have entered the mind of the Soviet government as a whole, however, nor any member of it, to represent its bourgeois counteragents as friends of peace, and still less to invite the communist parties of Germany, Poland, or Estonia to support with their votes the bourgeois governments which had signed these treaties. It is just this question, moreover, which is decisive for the revolutionary education of the masses. The Soviets could not help signing the Brest-Litovsk Peace, just as exhausted strikers cannot help signing the most cruel conditions imposed by the capitalists. But the vote cast in favor of this peace by the German Social Democrats in the hypothetical form of abstention was denounced by the Bolsheviks as a support of brigandage and brigands. Although the Rapallo Agreement with democratic Germany was signed 4 years later on a formal basis of equal rights for both parties. Nevertheless, if the German Communist Party had made this a pretext to express confidence in the diplomacy of its country, it would have been forthwith expelled from the International. the fundamental line of the international policy of the Soviets rested on the fact that this or that commercial, diplomatic, or military bargain of the Soviet government with the imperialists, inevitable in the nature of the case, should in no case limit or weaken the struggle of the proletariat of the corresponding capitalist country. For in the last analysis, the safety of the workers' state itself could be guaranteed only by the growth of the world revolution. When Chicherin, during the preparations for the Geneva Conference, proposed for the benefit of public opinion in America to introduce certain democratic changes in the Soviet Constitution, Lenin, in an official letter of January 23, 1922, urgently recommended that Chicherin be sent immediately to a sanatorium. If anybody had dared in those days to propose that we purchase the good favor of democratic imperialism by adhering, let us say, to the false and hollow Kellogg Pact, or by weakening the policy of the Communist International, Lenin would have indubitably have proposed that the innovator be sent to an insane asylum, and he would hardly have met any opposition in the Politburo. The leaders of those days were especially implacable in relation to all kinds of pacifist illusions. League of Nations, collective security, courts of arbitration, disarmament, etc., seeing in them only a method of lulling the toiling masses in order to catch them unawares when a new war breaks out. In the program of the party, drafted by Lenin and adopted at the Congress of 1919, we find the following unequivocal lines on the subject. The developing pressure of the proletariat, and especially its victories in individual countries, are strengthening the resistance of the exploiters and impelling them to new forms of international consolidation of the capitalists, in brackets, League of Nations, etc., end of brackets, which, organizing on a world scale the systematic exploitation of all the peoples of the earth, are directing their first efforts towards the immediate suppression of the revolutionary movements of the proletariat of all countries. All this inevitably leads to a combination of civil wars within the separate states, with revolutionary wars, both of the proletarian countries defending themselves and of the oppressed peoples against the yoke of the imperialist powers. In these conditions, the slogans of pacifism, international disarmament under capitalism, courts of arbitration, etc., are not only reactionary utopias, but downright deceptions of the toilers designed to disarm the proletariat and distract it from the task of disarming the exploiters. These lines from the Bolshevik program constitute an advance, estimate, and moreover a truly devastating one of the present Soviet foreign policy, and the policy of the Communist International, with all of its pacifistic friends in every corner of the earth. After the period of intervention and blockade, the economic and military pressure of the capitalist world on the Soviet Union did, to be sure, prove considerably weaker than might have been feared. Europe was still thinking of the past and not the future war. Then came the unheard of economic world crisis, causing prostrations in the ruling classes of the whole world. It was only thanks to this that the Soviet Union could survive the trials of the first five-year plan, when the country again became an arena of civil war, famine, and epidemic. The first years of the second five-year plan, which have brought an obvious betterment of internal conditions, have coincided with the beginning of an economic revival in the capitalist world, and a new tide of hopes, appetites, yearnings, and preparations for war. The danger of a combined attack on the Soviet Union takes palpable form in our eyes only because the country of the Soviets is still isolated, because to a considerable extent this 1/6 of the Earth's surface is a realm of primitive backwardness, because the productivity of labor, in spite of the nationalization of the means of production, is still far lower than in capitalist countries, and finally, what is at present most important, because the chief detachments of the world proletariat are shattered, distrustful of themselves, and deprived of reliable leadership. Thus, the October Revolution, in which its leaders saw only a prelude to world revolution, but which in the course of things has received a temporary independent significance, reveals in this new historic stage its deep dependence upon world development. Again, it becomes obvious that the historic question, who shall prevail, cannot be decided within national boundaries, that interior successes and failures only prepare more or less favorable conditions for its decision on the world arena. The Soviet bureaucracy, we must do it this justice, has acquired a vast experience in directing popular masses, in lulling them to sleep, dividing and weakening them, or deceiving them outright for the purpose of unlimited domination over them. But for this very reason, it has lost every trace of the faculty of revolutionary education of the masses. Having strangled independence and initiative in the lower ranks of the people at home, it naturally cannot provoke critical thought and revolutionary daring on the world arena. Moreover, as a ruling and privileged stratum, it values infinitely more the help and friendship of those who are kin to it in social type in the West. Bourgeois radicals, reformist parliamentarians, trade union bureaucrats, than of the rank-and-file workers who are separated from it by social chasms. This is not the place for a history of the decline and degeneration of the Third International, a subject to which the author has dedicated a series of independent investigations published in almost all the languages of the civilized world. The fact is that, in its capacity as leader of the Communist International, the nationally limited and conservative, ignorant, and irresponsible Soviet bureaucracy has brought nothing but misfortune to the workers' movement of the world. As though, in historic justice, the present international position of the Soviet Union is determined to a far higher degree by the consequences of the defeat of the world proletariat than by the successes of an isolated socialist construction. It is sufficient to recall that the defeat of the Chinese Revolution in 1925 to 1927, which untied the hands of Japanese militarism in the East, and the shattering of the German proletariat, which led to the triumph of Hitler and the mad growth of German militarism, are alike the fruits of the policy of the Communist International. Having betrayed the world revolution, but still feeling loyal to it, the Thermidorian bureaucracy has directed its chief efforts to neutralizing the bourgeoisie. For this it was necessary to seem a moderate, respectable, authentic bulwark of order. But in order to seem something successfully, and for a long time, you have to be it. The organic evolution of the ruling stratum has taken care of that. Thus, retreating step by step before the consequences of its own mistakes, the bureaucracy has arrived at the idea of ensuring the inviolability of the Soviet Union by including it in the system of the European Asiatic status quo. What could be finer, when all is said and done, than an eternal pact of non-aggression between socialism and capitalism? The present official formula of foreign policy, widely advertised not only by the Soviet diplomacy, which is permitted to speak in the customary language of its profession, but by the Communist International, which is supposed to speak the language of revolution, reads, "We don't want an inch of foreign land, but we will not surrender an inch of our own," as though it were a question of mere quarrels about a bit of land, and not of the world's struggle of two irreconcilable social systems. When the Soviet Union considered it more sensible to surrender the Chinese Eastern Railroad to Japan, this act of weakness, prepared by the collapse of the Chinese Revolution, was celebrated as a manifestation of self-confident power in the service of peace. In reality, by surrendering to the enemy an extremely important strategic highway, the Soviet government promoted Japan's further seizures in North China and her present attempts upon Mongolia. That forced sacrifice did not mean a neutralization of the danger, but at the best, a short breathing spell, and at the same time, a mighty stimulus to the appetites of the ruling military clique in Tokyo. The question of Mongolia is already a question of the strategic positions to be occupied by Japan in a future war against the Soviet Union. The Soviet government found itself this time compelled to announce openly that it would answer the intrusions of Japanese troops into Mongolia with war. Here, however, it is no question of the immediate defense of our land. Mongolia is an independent state. A passive defense of the Soviet boundaries seemed sufficient only when nobody was seriously threatening them. The real method of defense of the Soviet Union is to weaken the positions of imperialism and strengthen the position of the proletariat and the colonial peoples throughout the earth. An unfavorable correlation of forces might compel us to surrender many inches of land, as it did at the moment of the Brest-Litovsk peace, the Riga peace, and the matter of the handing over of the Chinese Eastern Railroad. At the same time, the struggle for a favorable change in the correlation of world forces puts upon the workers' state a continual obligation to come to the help of the liberative movements in other countries. But it is just this fundamental task which conflict absolutely with the conservative policy of the status quo.